Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Dan Trotter, Pretty Good Bible Studies. The video that I'm going to attempt here is called the Edifice Complex. It concerns the place of meeting in the New Testament house church. The place of meeting was in the home. If you would like to learn more about the New Testament house church, I would suggest that you perhaps look up this playlist, which I call House Church Playlist, and I've got all kinds of videos about all kinds of aspects of New Testament church ecclesiology. This particular video will look at scriptural evidence for the New Testament church in the home, as well as scholarly evidence, as we try to establish the fact that there's no question, it's not controversial, the early church did meet in a home and did not meet in special ecclesiastical barns. So without further ado, let's begin this video. Hope you enjoy it. All right, the church in the home, the Edifice Complex. Now that title, of course, is a play on words of the Edifice Complex. I got that years ago from another house church writer, and I think it's a great term because people do have a complex about meeting in a home. You can't do church in a home. I recall one time somebody was asking a friend of mine when my friend told him that he was meeting in a home for church. And his friend looked at him in amazement and said, "Where do you put the choir?" Of course, the answer to that, there were no choirs in the New Testament house church. So you don't need a place to put the choir. Everybody's the choir, everybody sings, but because of mindsets, people are so ingrained with the idea that church has got to meet in a special ecclesiastical building that they have a complex about it. So we're going to call this the Edifice Complex. Now, here's a common objection to advocating church in a home. People say this: look, the living stones, the people, are more important than the physical stones, the building. As a matter of fact, that actually is true. But this overlooks a very important point. The living stones are influenced greatly by the physical stones. So if you care about the living stones, you better start worrying about the physical stones, where you meet. It will affect the quality of your worship. It will affect your mindset. Now, architects know this. Steve Jobs spent hours and months and a year, I don't know how long, trying to design the Apple corporate headquarters. He tried to get a lot of light in there, a lot of glass, and then he tried to break down walls so people could see through it, and then he had to have a lot of open areas where people had to go through those areas to meet each other, because he was trying to break down the compartmentalization, the hyper-functionalization of a typical corporation, such as, for example, Sony, which should have come out with the iPad because they had Walkman, but they didn't do it because they had divisions that were fighting each other. And Steve Jobs said, no, we don't want that function in our business. We want people to cross-pollinate, and so he designed a building that would facilitate that. He wasn't so super spiritual that he thought, well, that doesn't matter. In fact, the reason that Apple Computer Company, or Apple, is the most valuable company on the face of the planet today is because of the physical design efforts that went into building the Apple products. You've got to read Steve Jobs' Isaacson biography to appreciate how much effort he went into the physical design of his phone, not the computer, the physical aspects of it, because he knew that people are influenced by their objects, the objects that are around them. So let's don't get real super spiritual here and say, well, it doesn't matter if we meet in a house, or if we meet in a big cathedral, or if we meet in a bar, or if we meet outside. Oh, yes, it does matter. It matters a lot. You know, bankers know this. They always put debtors in a low chair at the end of a long table, and they're sitting up high at the end of the table, and you, the loan applicant, are shrunk down at the bottom of the table, coming up to your neck, so that the lender is the head and the borrower is the tail. This happens all the time. High church advocates of smells and bells, they know it. You go into a building and you hear Gregorian chants, and you see the dim lights and the vaulted ceilings and the rich tapestries everywhere. You know, that's going to affect you. It gives you a kind of a religious, emotional feeling. So, yes, meeting in a house, it is important where you meet. All right, well, we're going to start out this is how I'm going to organize the talk. We're going to start out by establishing the New Testament pattern. Now, this is easy. It's from Scripture and from the scholars who have studied the Scripture and church history. We know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the early New Testament church met in the home. The next thing I'm going to do is look at the benefits of the home church, how the form of the home church benefits New Testament functions such as consensual decision making, intimacy, that kind of thing. And then we're going to look at number 3, problems with church buildings. And then we're going to number 4, we're going to look at problems with meetings in homes. All right, let's start out with the New Testament church pattern. I'm going to ask you some preliminary questions. Now, these questions are loaded. They have a pedagogical purpose. They're aimed at making you think. Number 1, how many church-owned church buildings are found in the New Testament? When I say church-owned, I mean there's a special, separate religious organization called a church that owns its very own church building. How many of these can you find in the New Testament? The answer is 0, none, because all the early church buildings, church Christians met in homes for church. Second preliminary question. How many church-owned church buildings built within 2.5 centuries after Jesus' death have been found by archaeologists? So now we go from the Scripture, we go to archaeology. Have any independently owned church buildings been found before the year 250 A.D.? How many? The answer is 0. Now, the first such, there was a church building found in Dura Europa about mid-3rd century, say 250 A.D., and that's been well excavated. It was obviously a home that had been adapted to a church. That doesn't prove that it was church-owned. It might have just been a home that decided that they wanted to change it so that they could accommodate more people maybe. But there's no evidence. There's absolutely no archaeological evidence that any Christian church, any Christian ecclesiastical organization owned their own building, because the early church all met in homes. Next preliminary question. How many New Testament writers worshiped in special religious buildings before they were saved, but moved to home worship after they were saved? The answer to that is all but 1. Now, who was that one that didn't meet in a synagogue and then moved to the home? The synagogue was a special religious building, and all the Jewish writers of the New Testament, they worshiped in synagogues, and then they moved to a home. So they moved away from a church building, not towards a church building. You know, many people today, they'll start a church in their home. Francis Chan did this. He started a church in his home, and then he built a mega church. It grew and grew and grew. And then he got sick of that, and he went back to having church in his home again after he abandoned his mega church. Well, the New Testament writers, most of them were Jewish, and they met in synagogues. And then when they got saved, they went to the home. They went away from the special religious building, not toward it. Now, there was one, Luke. He never did. He never did worship in a special religious church building because he was a Gentile pagan. He just moved straight into the home. So I think with these guided questions, you can see where I'm going to. The early church met in the home. Now, here's another preliminary question. Did worship by believers in church-owned church buildings begin before Constantine joined the Roman Empire with the church, or afterwards? In other words, when the church became joined with the state, that process began in 325 AD when Constantine made the Christian church legal. And actually, he did more than that. He actually subsidized the church. He gave the church buildings. He confiscated pagan buildings and gave them to the church. So before Constantine, did anybody? So when did the idea of believers meeting in a special ecclesiastical building, a church-owned church building, when did that happen? It happened after the state became joined with the church. Now, the joining of the state with the church, was that a good thing or a bad thing? It was a bad thing. What I'm trying to say here is church buildings are a product of the union of church and state. It's not a good thing. It's a bad thing. Church buildings are a bad thing, folks. I know that sounds radical, but hey, I control the microphone, I control the spin. So let's look at again, trying to establish the New Testament pattern. Let's look at 2 ways we can do that. We can show that the church was in the home using the scriptures, and we can show that the church met in the home quoting the scholars. Let's start with the scriptures. I'm going to give you 9. Romans 16:5. Greet also the church in their house. Whose house was Paul talking about? Priscilla and Aquila's house in Rome. So there was a church in Priscilla and Aquila's house in Rome. Second example, 1 Corinthians 16:19. Priscilla and Priscilla have now left Rome and gone to Corinth, where Paul worked with them making tents, if I recall. Paul writes to the Corinthians. He says, the churches of Asia send you greetings. Aquila and Prisca, that's Priscilla, Aquila and Prisca, together with the church in their house, send you hearty greetings in the Lord. So now Aquila and Priscilla have started another church in their house in Corinth. Third example, Colossians 4:15. Give my greetings to the brothers of Laodicea and to Nympha and the church in her house. So there was a church at Colossae in Nympha's house. All right, so now we've got a church in Rome, a house church in Rome, a house church in Corinth, and a house church in Colossae. Corinth. So we got one in the Italian peninsula, one in Greek, and one in the Anatolian peninsula, Turkey, present-day Turkey. Philemon 1:2 is my fourth example. And Aphia, our sister, many people think Aphia was Philemon's wife, and Aphia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier, he's greeting them, and the church in your house, which is probably at Colossae. Most people think Philemon was at Colossae. So again, now we have a church in Colossae. Now, the interesting question I have here, since there was a church in Nympha's house in Colossae, and there is a church in Philemon's house, which is probably in Colossae, that could be the same church, or it could be two different house churches. I say that because some people say there's only one church in one city. Now, they could probably, here we have a case where there might be two houses. It doesn't really matter. The point is they met in the house. It doesn't matter for my point here. Fifth example, Acts 8:3. This is in Jerusalem, but Saul was ravaging the church in Jerusalem and entering house after house. He dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. So how did Paul find the Christians that he persecuted? He did it in Jerusalem by going house to house. Let's move on to Acts 2:46. This is again talking about the church in Jerusalem. And they, the early Christians, continuing daily with one accord in the temple and breaking bread from house to house. Breaking bread means taking communion. House to house is where they did it. So Paul persecuted them house to house, and they took communion house to house. The early New Testament church in Jerusalem was in the home. So now we've got a house church in Italy. We've got one in Corinth in Greece. Now we go over to the Anatolian Peninsula, Asia Minor. We've got at least one in Colossae. And now we go over to Jerusalem. We got house churches in Jerusalem. Everywhere. Breaking bread was the Lord's Supper. As I said, this was not evangelism, by the way. This was eating the Lord's Supper. All right, now let's go to 2 John 1:10. If anyone, John says, if anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house or give him any greeting. Now, John was probably writing in Ephesus, most people think, probably after he got off the Isle of Patmos in his exile. And John says, don't let anybody with a bad teaching come into your house. Well, I used to think that meant into your private house, but since he's talking about teaching, he's probably talking about teaching in a church meeting, so that implies that the church meeting is in a house. It doesn't prove it, but it does imply it strongly. I remember one time a couple of Mormon missionaries came to a house of a friend of mine, and I had just read this verse, and I went to the door, and I went ranting and fuming and saying, you can't come in here. The Bible says that if you bring a bad teaching, don't come into my house or to my friend's house. I think that I overinterpreted that verse. I think what I should owe those Mormons an apology. What I should have said was, come on in and let me tell you why you're in a cult, and that if you don't believe in Jesus, you're going to hell. That's what I should have done. Instead, I ran them off because of this verse. I think the verse refers to meeting in the house, where a house church, where teaching is given. You don't let people teach false teaching in your house church. All right. As I said, house probably refers to a church, not a private home, because of that word teaching. that word teaching right there. Now let's go to example number 8, Acts 16:40. That's the apostles that were being talked about here. They went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia. And Lydia lived at Philippi. They went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia at Philippi. When they saw the brethren, they encouraged them and departed. All right, now Philippi is on the border of the Adriatic Sea. If you're in Greece and go, the Aegean Sea. If you're in Greece and go northeast up the coast, past Macedonia, into Thrace, right at the border of Macedonia and Thrace is where Philippi was. And there was a house church there. So, all over the empire, all scattered through the scriptures, you can see the early church meeting in homes. There's just no question about it. There's no church buildings. They all met in homes. Now, let's look at James 2, verses 2 through 3 as our ninth example of church in a home. Ninth scriptural example. For if a man comes into your assembly with a gold ring, and there also comes in a poor man in dirty clothes, and you pay special attention to the one who is wearing the fine clothes, and say, you sit here in a good place, and you say to the poor man, sit down by my footstool. Well, a footstool is not in a special religious church building with all the chairs lined up in a row with the pulpit in the front. A footstool is in somebody's house. And James was addressing the Christians in Jerusalem probably with the same who met house to house. As we showed in Acts, they broke the Lord's Supper. They had the Lord's Supper house to house. Paul persecuted them house to house, and they had footstools in the houses according to James. The word is hupopodion, by the way, the Greek word, and hupo is under, and podia means foot, like podion means foot, like podiatrist, under the foot. It's a footstool. It's a piece of household furniture. All right, so the evidence of the scriptures is clear. The church met in the home. Now, let's see. Let me finish this slide. There was a footstool in this. There was a footstool in the assembly here, and footstools are only found in homes. Now, let's go to see what the scholars say about the New Testament pattern. What do the scholars say? I'm going to read them one by one, and I'm going to focus on their qualifications to show that this is not fringe stuff I'm giving you here, folks. This is down-the-line evangelical scholarship, or at least Christian scholarship. We'll start with Graydon F. Snyder. I don't know if he was evangelical. He published this book with Mercer University, but he was an archaeologist. He wrote a book called Antipacum, which is before the peace. The peace was the peace between the Roman Empire and the church, which took place in 325 with Constantine. This is what if I can stay there. This is what Graydon Snyder says about church buildings in the period before Constantine. Quote, there is no literary evidence nor archaeological indication that any home was converted into an extant church building, nor is there any extant church that certainly was built prior to Constantine. Consequently, we have no evidence regarding the intentional structure of a Constantinian meeting place of a Christian meeting place prior to the peace. There is no evidence, no archaeological evidence of any home that was before Constantine. Ladies and gentlemen, I've got to interrupt myself here. I just said that Graydon Snyder said there was no archaeological evidence, no extant archaeological evidence. Earlier I said that there was archaeological evidence at Europa in about 250 BC, which was before the peace, which was before Constantine in 325. What Graydon Snyder is saying here is there's no extant archaeological evidence, which means there's no existing building that's still around that was used as a special church building. It's a small point, but I thought I would, just for the sake of accuracy, mention it here. All right, our next quote is from Lane Dennis, who is the editor of the ESV Study Bible. At least this is a note in the ESV Study Bible. This note says this: early Christian churches, since they were small and not recognized as a legitimate or legal religion, met in homes. Next quote, Martin Selman, who's a lecturer in Old Testament at Spurgeon's College in London, in the New Bible Dictionary, says this: the theme of the household of God undoubtedly owed much to the function of the house in early Christianity as a place of meeting and fellowship. The function of the house in early Christianity was the place of meeting and fellowship. Next, William Hendrickson, who's a great commentator. I've used him before. He says this: since in the first, and this is the commentary on Romans, Hendrickson's commentary on Romans, since in the first and second centuries church buildings, in the sense in which we think of them today, were not yet in existence, families would hold services in their own homes. The early church numbered many hospitable members, and they ready and eager to offer their facilities for religious use, meetings, services, etc. Next quote, W.H. Griffith Thomas. Here's another commentary on the Epistle to the Romans. For 2 or 3 centuries, Christians met in private houses. There seems little doubt that these informal gatherings of small groups of believers had great influence in preserving the simplicity and purity of early Christianity. Next scholar, Donald Guthrie, in his book New Testament Theology, well-known evangelical scholar. The expression in church, in ecclesia, refers to an assembly of believers. There is no suggestion of a special building. Indeed, the idea of a church as representing a building is totally alien to the New Testament. Next quote, David Watson in a book called I Believe in the Church. For the first 2 centuries, the church met in small groups in the homes of its members. Significantly, these 2 centuries mark the most powerful and vigorous advance of the church, which perhaps has never been equaled. The lack of church buildings was no hindrance to the rapid expansion of the church. Instead, it seemed a positive help. Now, here's Martin Luther in his book, The German Mass and the Order of Divine Service. Now, this quote is especially interesting because Lutherans are not exactly known for house churches. They're known for fancy buildings. This is what Luther said: those who are desirous of being Christians in earnest should assemble by themselves in some house to pray, to read, to baptize, and to receive the sacrament and practice other Christian works. Well, now that's basically means to have church, is it not? Martin Luther is saying, hey, maybe we ought to meet in homes for church. He says, I have not the requisite persons for it. Hey, that sounds like us today, does it not? I have not the requisite persons for it, nor do I see many who are urgent for it. Hey, I feel your pain, Martin. But should it come to pass that I must do it, and that such pressure is put upon me, as that I find myself unable with a good conscience to leave it undone, then I will gladly do my part to secure it, and it will help it on as best as I can. Now, I like that quote because it shows how hard it is once you have centuries of church tradition building buildings and church structures and church systems. It's hard to fight it. You know, Martin Luther had a hard time fighting it. He lived most of his life on the fear of death. And it's about as bad today. You try to do a house church and everybody turns on you like, what are you, crazy? Well, no, I'm not crazy. I'm scriptural. It's the American church tradition, in my humble opinion, that's crazy. That's what's crazy. Not that I'll ever call any church system today crazy, unless somebody tried to say that the church in the home was crazy. I might respond that way. Okay, I've got another. I don't have it on my PowerPoints. Didn't have it in my notes, but I've got a book by a Catholic. Forgot his name. He had a little short summary of early church history, and a Catholic guy said, oh yeah, the church met in their homes. I thought it was pretty good. Lutherans, Catholics, everybody knows the church met in the home. Now, the problem is that even though all the scholars and the scriptures clearly point out to the fact of the church, that the early church met in the home, is most people say, well, we don't care. They can do it their way, we do it our way. We don't care about the church pattern. We don't care about apostolic traditions. We don't care about the authority of the apostles. We don't care. If what's right for the early church is right for the early church, what's right for me is right for me. Postmodern nonsense. We need to follow the church pattern. All right, so much for the church pattern. Now we're going to look at the benefits of meeting in the home. Now, the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to try to show that the church is a certain, in the home is a certain form of doing church. The building is a certain form, and that form facilitates certain New Testament functions. I'm going to use the idea that form follows the function. Once you have a function that you want to accomplish, then the form's got to follow that. I'm going to try to show that the church in the home establishes 5 New Testament functions. First, the Lord's Supper is a full meal, can only really be done in a home. Mutual ministry can only be done in a home, really, not in the big church building. That accountability and church discipline, the way that Jesus envisioned it in Matthew 16 and 18, can't be done in a big building. It's impossible to take church discipline problems to the whole church, as the Scripture says, so we take it to the elders, which the Scripture does not say. Building consensus to make consensual church decisions, as I pointed out, was the way that decision making was done in the early church. In a previous video, I pointed that out. Well, you can't do that unless if in a big building, you need to do that in a home. And family-like intimacy can only be done in the home. So that's all the benefits. I'll just give you an overview there. So let's look at the benefits. And as I said, I'm going to use this Buckminster Fuller architectural design slogan that has become very, very famous. Form follows function. Form follows function. The home church form facilitates New Testament functions. We have a function that we want to carry out, and the New Testament form facilitates that. Now, let me give you a homely example. Let's say that I have a function I want to carry out. I want to cross the Atlantic Ocean and go from America to England. I need a form of transportation. I've got 2 choices. I can choose A, an airplane, B, a boat. Which form best facilitates my function? Which form should follow the function that I have, getting across the ocean? Well, obviously the answer is A, the airplane. Now let me ask you, what's more important, crossing the Atlantic Ocean, or the way that I cross the Atlantic Ocean, the form of my transportation? Well, obviously, what's most important is the goal, which is to get across the ocean. But what happens if you choose the wrong way of getting across the ocean? You can take a boat, it's twice as expensive and takes 10 times as long. Yeah, you'll get across the ocean, but which form best facilitates the function that you're interested in? And you see my analogy is, yeah, you can carry out some of the New Testament functions with a big religious church building, you can, but which form best gets us there to New Testament church life? The house church does. All right, so here's the first New Testament function, the Lord's Supper as a full meal. It's hard to eat a full meal every week in a church building. It's too impractical, and so people drop the Lord's Supper, and then you've killed one of the most important functions, the most important function of the New Testament church. That's why they came together, in order to eat. And you've killed that by meeting in a building. Second function, New Testament function that the house church form facilitates, mutual ministry. One brother ministering to another brother. Each one has a gift that he contributes to the church meeting. Mutual ministry is real hard to do in a large church building because you can't even see the people on the other side of the building. You don't even know who they are, and you're not going to go up there and give them a prophecy or a word of encouragement or put your arm around them and say, I need to pray for you. You're not going to do that. You don't even know who they are. They're strangers. So mutual ministry works better in the home. The function of mutual ministry is best facilitated by the form of the house church. The third New Testament function, which is best facilitated by the form of the church in the home, is accountability in church discipline. How are you accountable to a bunch of strangers in a large 5,000 member church meeting? You're not accountable to them because they don't know you, and you could go home and watch porn right after church, and they would never know. But I guarantee you in a home church, when people get to know each other, you start watching porn, somebody's going to find out about it. Or whatever else. You're drinking too much, beating your wife, somebody's going to find out about it. And they're going to hold you accountable. Can't do that in a big church meeting. Same thing with church discipline. How are you going to carry the problem to the whole church, as Jesus said? He didn't say carry it on the third step of church discipline. He didn't say go to the church, to the elders. He said go to the church. Can't do that in a big church. You can't air sensitive disciplinary issues in front of a bunch of strangers. Can't do that. The fourth function, New Testament function, that the house church forum facilitates is building consensus. As I said in the previous video, the early church made decisions by consensus. I gave 5 examples of that. Well, that was done in a home church context. You can't build consensus in a large church building because it's hard enough to get consensus with a few people. You talk about thousands of people, getting them to agree in a unanimous fashion or a near unanimous fashion. It's not going to happen. So you throw that out too, and you have decision making by the elders, or decision making by the pastor, and that decision is then announced ex cathedra to the congregation. Those who like it stay, those who don't split. E, the fifth New Testament function that the New Testament home church forum facilitates, family-like intimacy. And that's one of the greatest things about home church. You get to know everybody. It's hard to get family-like intimacy in a large church building because you don't know anybody. They're not close to you, and you're not close to them. The sermon is over. You go into the foyer, the atrium, you shake hands with the pastor, and you say bye-bye, and you go home. Watch a movie, watch a ball game, fall asleep. The house church avoids that. In fact, most house churches after the Lord's Supper meeting, people hang around all afternoon. They love talking to each other. They love being with one another. They don't even go home. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I am finished with the first 2 sections of my PowerPoint here. I got one parting shot of my PowerPoint that I left out. The church is not a corporation, and that is what ecclesiastical warehouses look like. They look like corporate headquarters somewhere. All right, I have finished with the first 2 subjects of this slide here in this first video, the New Testament pattern and the benefits of the home church. Next video, we'll talk about problems with church buildings and problems with meeting in homes. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you watch the next one.